Wildcats. I'm Zaira Altaya.
And I'm Molly Stitt.
And thank you for joining us on this.
Word to the Wildcat podcast.
On this sunny day, we will be discussing the topics of foundations of leadership.
We would like to introduce today's guest, Ronnie.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ronnie Burris. I use he, they pronouns. I'm in my fourth and final year here at Central Washington University as a senior, and I'm so excited to be here today.
Thank you so much for joining us. So today we wanted to really talk about the topic of representations, more specifically Black representation in graduate programs and how important it is for people to really see people like themselves taking these big steps and these next steps in higher education. Can you talk a little bit about your experience, if you've experienced lack of representation, and who kind of inspired you to take the next step?
100%. So I can kind of work backwards in a second here. So currently where I'm at is I have been accepted into 4 universities for my master's program. I'm currently pursuing a master's in higher education student affairs, or the affiliated acronyms associated with that. And I have been admitted into some of the top universities in the nation for that program. So that's pretty solid. Admitted at Michigan State University, Ohio State University, Colorado State University, and Bowling Green State University. Thank you.
Congratulations.
Real quick, that's amazing.
Yeah.
When I tell y'all, this was literally one of the hardest things I've ever done in my entire life. Mm-hmm. I am not capping there. And we can we'll dive into that a little more later, I'm sure. Mm-hmm. But what kind of working backwards inspired me to get into graduate school is I knew I wanted to work in education. Mm-hmm. My mom, she was a paraeducator when I was a kid, and I ended up going to her elementary school that she was teaching at in kindergarten, and I always looked up to my mom. So I knew I wanted to work in ed, or education in general. So then throughout K through 12, went through the system, had a decent time, not the greatest, obviously lack of representation and teachers and stuff. But I came to university wanting to work in education. So I wanted to do music ed, didn't work out. Wanted to be a law school professor, didn't work out. And throughout that process, what I think inspired me to pursue this specific graduate education is I noticed in the university system in general, there's not a lot of people that look like me. Mm-hmm. There's not going to be a lot of Black folk in general, and there's definitely not a lot of Black male identifying people. So when you go through it, it's hard to exist in a space that you don't see yourself belonging in, or that you don't see yourself empowered in. So a lot of the mentors that I had were white, were women, and that was totally fine, but then it was hard to believe that I could make it to the end of this university journey without that representation. So I think 2 of the people that really inspired me to want to pursue this specific graduate school track were Tiara Felder. She was a previous orientation coordinator here. And she was one of the first Black people I saw on this campus when I came here for orientation. Ended up becoming my supervisor, and she really facilitated that love that I had for the work of student affairs and the drive of going into a master's program. Mm-hmm. The other person was Dr. Shantae Elbert. She was a previous associate dean of health and wellness here at Central, and seeing someone that was so highly educated, because she ended up getting her PhD in education in a system that I already didn't see people represented on myself in undergraduate classes, was dang, I can actually do this. I can really get to the end and pursue this super high level of education and make an impact on the systems of education that we live in.
So I think you touched on a lot of really important things. I think when talking about higher education and not having representation, something that I've found is that a lot of people that aren't Black will tell you things from faculty to students to friends will be it's not that hard, just work hard, you'll be okay. Or the one that triggers me the most is I understand where you're coming from. Well, I'm no, you're not Black, so you don't understand. So I think it's a very singular experience. And I think you just brought up really important points of how you mentioned that you were excited to see Black faculty, and that was the first time that you kind of saw that representation. So I think that's a very valid point and something I can definitely relate to. Mm-hmm.
Also, from an education standpoint, I'm an education major. I also think it's important for especially faculty and staff in education settings to be supportive and also stand by their claims and the claims of the school, because what message is it sending when faculty and staff and students, because students represent the school, if they're doing it just for performative activism and just saying, well, you know, this isn't right, but then continuing to display microaggressions.
100%. And I think one thing I started to think about is like talking about those systems. What I think a lot of people don't understand is when you're talking about like K through 12, a lot of that, yes, comes down from like a federal level, but a lot of that is state and like local. So like there's local school boards that are like controlling like to the extent the content that's taught inside of educational systems. Like we see now in like headlines conversations about book burning because these books are unhealthy for kids to be reading for their development, or it has dangerous ideas and stuff. I think specifically what's so interesting for me about like the context of higher education, so like both the academic side of things of like the professoriate, so like people becoming professors, and also like the student services side of things, administrative side of things, is the governing organizations that like a lot of these universities are following, especially on like the student services aspect of things, are ran by a couple of things. It's like the associations of college personnel administrators, ACPA, and then NASPA, which is the National Association of Student Personnel Administrators. So like these are like the top organizations where like anyone that you're meeting in like executive level leadership, like a president, like a provost over like student affairs and academic affairs, a dean of students, they're all extensively associated with. And if you look at the leadership for those departments, especially like in the late 80s, early 70s, all that jazz, you're not going to see a lot of people that look like me there. You're not going to see a lot of people that look like a variety of people that exist inside of our university systems. So they're taking in these perspectives of one person. They're not taking in my perspective or holistically taking it in, because they're looking to advance their own perspectives of education and what that should look like. Mm-hmm. So then it becomes difficult for people like me to exist in a system, or any of us to exist in a system that wasn't made for us to exist in, mm-hmm. or made for us to thrive in at least. I think one thing that I've noticed as well, mm-hmm. and this is kind of interesting now that I'm like going through that other side of that process of being like, okay, like wanting to be a faculty member at one point, but also looking at like a faculty of other universities, where people like in universities will put their money where their mouth is. Mm-hmm. I know like here, I can count the number of Black faculty members that I've encountered on my hand. And I think that Central does a pretty good job of like engaging in restorative justice policies within education and like trying to uplift the voices and experiences of marginalized populations. But at the end of the day, like there's a pretty clear problem of like faculty members having a lack of representation of minority identities, and of student support staff having a lack of representation of marginalized identities. But I think what was really pivotal for me in my graduate search process is one of the universities I applied to for grad school, Michigan State University, put on this conference, which is called Advance to Adventure. And it's meant specifically for students that come from traditionally underrepresented racial backgrounds. And the number of faculty members that I saw of color, and mind you, this is just in one specific college of the university, so not all of the faculty of color across the entire university, outranked probably the number of Black faculty and staff members that I've seen on this entire campus in the entire 4 years that I've been here. They were very clear that like this was not a holistic picture of all of the diversity of their department, but they had brought in so many different Black faculty members, so many different Black support staff members, and so many different Latinx support members as well, to show that like this is not just a talking point for them. This is truly the work that they're doing, and they're putting their money where their mouth is, and like hiring these diverse voices to show students that like, for someone like myself that is Black, you can make it to the other side and you can be successful in your career.
I think you brought up a lot of great points when talking about like the importance of like schools actually having, like Black support staffs and Black faculty members, because I think, just being Black in general, but being Black in like the American education system is a very singular experience that nobody else can speak on unless you're Black. So I think it's great to have that representation there and people that have also experienced to help you kind of move along throughout your like academic path. Mm-hmm. If it's, getting a master's or a PhD, whatever it is. I think, that's something that's also not talked about enough, because it's often mentioned, well, we have these resources, we have like support staff, we have these like counselors that can help you, but then they're not Black. So it's like, mm-hmm. You know what I mean? So something that's always commonly said and that I've even heard is like, I don't know what it's like, but I'm here for you. Well, I'm like, that does nothing for me, and that does nothing for me. So I think it's important for schools to also, include that so people can have that resource, because imagine going in to get help and then they're like, well, I don't know what you're going through, but good luck. That's foolish.
100%.
Yeah.
And I wish that there were more resources like at undergraduate institutions like Central that are largely not dominated by graduate students on this campus. Like when I look at the schools I've applied to, Ohio State and Michigan State, their graduate school population is larger than our undergraduate school, our entire school population here. Mm-hmm. They have more grad students in their program than we have students that go to Central. So, of course, there's going to be an abundance of resources on those campuses. But what I've noticed a lot is when I talk to people about like, oh, I want to go to grad school, like this is the process I want to do, I recognize I am doing like a pretty unique search. But the realities of like the pictures they're painting of their grad school process have been astronomically different than the reality of my graduate school process. And I cannot stress that enough. I was telling one of my friends the other day, I was like, I genuinely understand now why a lot of Black people do not go through the grad school process. Because it is not pretty. Like, genuinely not pretty.
Yeah, I just started the process, and I've, experienced a lot of microaggressions, and yeah, I'll just leave it at that. So the language stays appropriate. But yeah, I don't think it's a secret. I'm a writer, so I've looked at a lot of, graduate programs that are, more specifically for library and information science, but also like creative writing and things like that. And one of the things that I was told right off the bat when I was speaking about, these graduate programs and like publishing books and like my collections of poetry, it was like, you should consider getting a pen name. And at the time I was like, I don't get it. But like looking back, they were kind of saying that like your full name would not be like socially accepted by the majority. Yeah, and so they were like, you should get a pen name. And I'm like, what? And they're like, yeah, your name, you got to change it. And it's because I have a traditional Sudanese name. So it's just like small things like that Black people run into that other people will never have to face. Uh-huh. And it was just so interesting to me. And it was kind of discouraging because if you don't really have a thick skin, I mean, you would just walk out the office and just forget the whole program. But it's just little things like that, or people being shocked when I like fill out, applications and things like that about income or like my parents' like marital status, just small like microaggressions like that I'm sure that white people don't have to face, being shocked that my parents are married and things like that. So it's like a lot of barriers that is very specific to the Black community that isn't often, spoken about. So it's like, it's not easy.
100%.
Yeah.
And like, I will first say I have never had an experience like that in like the grad school searching process. I think I, to be very honest, got like so burnt out from that process towards the end that I even started not meeting with a lot of the grad schools I applied to. I only went to like informational sessions for like 2 of the schools that I applied to. So if anyone tells you the advice that you need to go to every single informational session that the school offers and get every single ounce of information before you apply and like get in, or that's going to determine whether you're getting admitted, not the reality, at least in my case, but I understand that's like, there's differences between academic programs. But that's mind-boggling to me. That's wild. And I do understand there's certain aspects of it, like especially I can't speak to all of it as just because I am a Black American, but I know that there's a couple of people that have been accepted into some of the programs I like I've gotten into, and one of them comes from Ghana, I believe, and he was messaging me specifically like, yo, can we talk? Because I don't even know if I want to go here, because some of the things that people have been like asking me questions about of like, are you going to be like successful in a program here because you haven't gone through the United States American like a university system? So he like wanted to ask me about what that experience is like. And I was like, I promise you're going to be fine. This is not like rocket science here, and education is education regardless of where you go. It's going to look a little bit different, but you can thrive. If you thrive in one educational system, you can find the ways to thrive in another, as long as it's not weaponizing your identities against you. But dang, that's something else.
Yeah, I was about to say, like, there's, you know, even within like the black community, there's different experiences, you know, whether you're like first generation, your parents have been to school, if you're, you know, whatever like lineage that you come from, you know, it's just like there's like a lot of different factors by itself. So it's like it's a very complicated process and it can be discouraging, but it's always great to hear everyone's experience and to validate those experiences.
I think the discouraging part is the one that like is not talked about enough. Like people use the buzzword of like imposter syndrome, like, oh, you know, like you're gonna experience imposter syndrome, but like it's okay, like you'll be fine. Or they'll try to like justify that imposter syndrome by like, well, think about your identities and like how difficult it was for you to get through undergrad and like how that will be considered in your application process. And it's like, that's just giving me more imposter syndrome because it's like, am I not qualified? Like, is it truly just like the trauma Olympics to some degree where it's like, oh, I only got in because of these traumas that I face in undergraduate education that like it's going to lead me to success in grad school. Because I remember there was one point where I was writing all my personal statements, getting all my references, like tailoring all my personal statements to these universities. And you go on their websites and you'll read their bios of like grad students. I'll tell you right now, I am not those bios. They will upfront put and tokenize their like marginalized students and their majority students that have some of the wildest resumes in the entire world. Like I remember I was looking at one student that had like organized and developed this entire chapter of this organization that serves like over 100,000 students across the nation, is like already doing like theoretical based research, is like fast tracked into a PhD program, probably going to be like the next like leading faculty member in the world on like his content area of like my degree. And I'm like thinking in my head, I'm like, this is someone I share identities with that like has a 4.0 GPA, like done things that I could not fathom doing in this experience or at this university. How in the world could I possibly be in that position? So then it's like the imposter syndrome of like, oh, dang, like I can't already survive with the identities that I hold. But even with the identities that I hold, I'm never going to be this person. So why can I even try to like get into the same program or do the same education that this person has?
I think it's a great thing that you like mentioned that, because just when, you know, you're black on the search for like your next, you know, step in like your academic journey, like you'll click on like a lot of university websites and they'll be like on like the front screen or like kind of like the home screen, if you will, it'll be like the one token like black person to kind of draw black students in. But when you look at the statistics, that's a hard word for me to say, it just doesn't make sense. And so they really have to like capture that one black person on campus to kind of pull in and kind of, you know, spark interest and, you know, make it feel like it's kind of an open and accepting place for us when it's really not. And so I noticed that was something as well. But I also want to touch on how people don't accurately describe the process, like of the application process. And I know we talked about that a little bit the other day, but even, you know, as I've just begun the process, you know, I've noticed that a lot of counselors and things, you know, besides the microaggressions, something else that they don't take into consideration is like the amount of, I guess privilege would be the correct word that they have, because you know, they're making a decent income and things like that. And so you can tell this by the way they word situations. And, you know, I had a conversation not that long ago about a few schools that I wanted to apply to. And I was like, you know, just venting. I'm like, goodness, like nobody told me that it was going to be like $150 for an just for somebody to look at my transcript. And, you know, the person I was speaking to was like, well, how many schools are you thinking about, you know, and I was like, I got, you know, 5 or 6. And so they're like about 600, you know, that's not bad. And I'm like, that's not bad. But then it like struck me that this person is like, you know, they're like, their job is to be a counselor and things like that. So they have a steady income. So that was probably nothing to them. But it was just interesting kind of the wording that's always used around students that are like in the application process, you know, it's just 600, it's not that bad, you know. And that's just like the beginning, you know, of the process. And there's so many, you know, more difficult steps that have to be taken that also nobody warns you about. So can you talk a little bit about some of the things that shocked you when you were going through with your application, or just surprised you?
Yes. So money, that was the first thing that like got me together real quick. I think a lot of times, like with first gen students such as myself and like Black first gen students as well, like these universities, like when they look for undergraduate students, do a lot of outreach programs. I know that Central for a fact literally came to my campus and like my high school campus, did on the spot admission. So I got into Central that same day. No application fee. It was completely waived. Didn't have to pay anything. Just looked at it, called it good. All the other schools I applied to, I think I probably spent like $100 on all my applications. When you apply for like grad school, at the end of my search, like in terms of like applications, all that jazz, have spent about $600, I would say. And for more context, I only applied to 4 universities. I had my transcripts sent to those 4 universities, and I paid the application fee for all 4 of those schools. So that's the difference. Is like the cost just up front is so high for a lot of these programs. I know for most of my programs, the application fee was around like $85. And then there's a processing fee because I had to pay credit cards because I don't got that kind of money. Just like drop 85 like right then and there. At the time I didn't. Then you have to pay the university to send over transcripts. So at our university, to send over official transcripts, it costs $15 per copy of the transcript. So that's another $60. So then after all things said and done, like I applied to all these schools. I paid $600 just for me to not even have a guarantee that I'm going to get into any of these master's programs. And for me to, at the end of the day, only choose one of these programs to go to. So I paid $600 for me to get just get perspective on an education. Mm-hmm. That in itself is already a gatekeeping mechanism. And I know people that like will apply to a lot of other programs outside of higher education, like masters or education masters, that pay upwards of like $200 per grad school application, mm-hmm. $150 per grad school application. And that is already just like limiting it in general. You're going to get all these students that are low income that cannot afford to like shell out all this extra money just to prospectively like apply to this school without a guarantee that you're going to get in.
Yeah, I think, you know, it's always great when people like put an emphasis that like when I say when I or you or whoever says application fee, that's just like the baseline fee, because, you know, to submit your, transcript and all that, there's another fee, and then processing fee, and then some schools you have to like mail it in, so you have to like account for like, expedited shipping mm-hmm. and things like that nobody really talks about. So it's very expensive, and it's a completely different process than applying to undergrad, because typically most undergrads you just submit your like diploma or your GPA, and then I think some schools there is still a application fee, mm-hmm. But it's usually, I would say, around like $50, and so it's a big jump and a big difference. And something else that's often brought up is like, well, see if you can get it waived. I could tell you right now that's like a really hard process, and a lot of people don't get it waived depending on like household income and things like that. If you make a certain amount, if they review it and they think you can pay it. So that's kind of frustrating too, because that's like the number one thing that counselors say, like, see if you can get it waived. I'm like, well, it's not that easy, and that doesn't happen for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. I think, speaking of that specifically, I remember I'd go on the websites to be like, do I qualify for a waiver? My parents still claim me as a dependent. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean that they're paying for my university. They just still claim me as a dependent. Same. And so I get the extra money, that the government thinks that I need, mm-hmm. or is enough for me to survive going to university. That doesn't mean it's enough.
Yeah.
So then when you apply and like you're looking for these grad school apps, they're just assumed, like, based off of your, like, FAFSA data and all that jazz, mm-hmm. that it's like, oh, well, like, if you can't afford it personally, somebody else in your life can afford it. But then it's like, how do I explain to my parents that are already, like, so out of the loop of what university looks like, what that next step of graduate school looks like that's even more unfathomable, to say, hey, I need $600 to apply to 4 different universities when I only have the chance of I don't have a guaranteed chance that I'm going to get into all of them. And then on top of that, I'm only going to choose one of those universities. And at that one university, there's not even a chance that I'm going to get full funding. So I'm going to have to take more money out just to get this degree, potentially. That's not my reality. None of my programs, if whatever program I select, I will be fully funded. But like, in other people's realities, that's what you're asking them to do when you're going through the grad school process financially.
Yeah, and then, working towards like the goal of being fully funded is a process in itself. And again, a lot of people will never see that day and they just have to pay out of pocket. I would say it's a very draining experience, and I think you touched on something earlier that was also really important before we wrap up here, and that was like when you mentioned the term like trauma Olympics, and I think that's very important as well, because when you want to take the next step in your like academic journey or you want to further your education, it should never be this hard and this draining. Like, there should never be this many tears, this much stress, this much, if I can make it, it should be an enjoyable experience. And it's actually very sad that for a lot of people, that are just low income or that face different barriers have to experience it as well. And so can you end the podcast, with some encouraging words for people that may be facing these same barriers?
100%. I think if I can do it, you can do it. And I know that doesn't like obviously like, okay, well, who's this person saying that I can do it, you can do it. To paint a picture like the reality of like this whole process. If someone tells you it's easy, they either are living in a whole different unfathomable reality than like the majority of people, or the majority of like Black people specifically, or they are truly just in denial or have an extreme propensity to handle stress. So when you do it, recognize that it's going to be hard. It is going to be one of the hardest things you likely do in your entire life. But the mission and what it means for both you, but everybody else that comes after you is so important. Because I recognize that if I were to quit, I'm losing the opportunity to make that same impact on all of the students that look like me in the future that I would be able to support and serve. Because just in making it through the process, just in going through the program and like attending classes, you are showing that us as Black people can do it. And you're representing this community in a lot of ways. I'm representing my ancestors. Like if I go to Ohio State, that is literally the university that my grandpa so desperately wanted to go to, but he knew that he couldn't afford it. He knew that the circumstances that he had would never allow him to do it. So I'm representing this person in my family and my lineage in a way that they never were able to do. So that reminder can be beneficial. And it's going to get harder, but you're going to get stronger. So if you can do anything to preserve yourself and to preserve your sanity, your emotional health, your emotional wellness, social wellness, do it. Because at the end of the day, once March hits and I get that job offer from my schools that tell me I'm fully funded, I'm going to be able to do the work that I so desperately wanted to do, and the past 6 months of work has paid off, it's going to be the most liberating feeling in the entire world. So if I can do it and I can make it through this entire process, I know that you can too.
I think those were great words, and I hope whoever's listening that's experiencing those barriers, can find some sort of peace or encouragement with that piece.
And then just one last thing, because I know that, obviously it can be difficult to do it alone. Some of the resources that I utilized in my search to kind of keep myself going were faculty members on campus that identified with identities that I hold. So Beretta, gosh, I'm blanking on her last name. She's the director of the academic advising for the College of Arts and Humanities. I had a conversation with her. She was very encouraging in that. If you're looking specifically for going into academics, look for the Black academics that are here on this campus and ask them their genuine experiences of going through the process. Look online. There's tons of videos of different Black graduate school, students and graduate school graduates that are now working in their fields or working within academics that are going to give you the reality of what their experience is like. Both the good, the bad, and the ugly. And it's going to paint you that realistic picture. And hopefully just seeing that they can do it will help you recognize that you can do it.
Well, thank you so much, Ronnie, for coming in.
Thank
and
you.
We really appreciated everything that you said about your experience and also sharing your insight for any students that, really needed to hear that because, your words were beautiful. So
Thank you.
They're really appreciated. So thank you so much for tuning in, Wildcats, on this episode. Streaming is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Google Podcasts, and 88.1 The Berg.
Make sure you tune in to the next season of Word to the Wildcats.
And thank you, Ronnie, again. And we'll see you Wildcats next quarter.
Go Wildcats! Yes! Woohoo!